We're jumping into John chapter 18 this evening. And John 18 is another one of those really significant chapters in John where the whole narrative shifts. John 1 through 12 is the public ministry of Jesus. John 13 through 17 is what I would call the private ministry of Jesus, where Jesus turns his attention away from the crowds and turns really to specifically speak to his disciples, the faithful 11, which are going to carry on the church. And John 17 ends with Jesus' final prayer. Well, 17 is the prayer. And it ends with him praying for unity. And tonight we go back to narrative, and we're looking at John 18, verses 1 through 27. And this is a long passage of Scripture. And the overarching story that we're going to be looking at tonight is that Jesus is betrayed in the garden, in the Kidron Valley. He is arrested, and then as they take him in, it's the story about Peter denying Jesus. And as I was thinking about tonight and prepping for tonight, the thing that came into my mind, the word that came into my mind again and again and again was the word crisis. In every sense of the word, this is a crisis moment. And the thing about crisis is crisis reveals who we are. You know, when times are good, when we're fat and happy, as I grew up saying, it's easy to look like a genius, right? It's easy to assume you have a good marriage when you have money in the bank and you aren't fighting every night when you get home from work, and nobody's threatening to leave one another, right? It's easy to think that you have a great relationship with your kids when you don't fight over dinner every night. It's easy for a CEO of a company or a founder of a company to look like a rock star when they have a technology or a service that is different and better than everybody else, and they have this competitive advantage and nobody else can compete with them. When times are good, it's easy to look like a genius. But when everything falls apart, when the chips are down, it reveals what's really going on. It's easy to have a good marriage when you have no kids in the house. It's a lot harder to have a good marriage when you've got 2 young kids in the house. I speak from experience. Yes. I see a lot of parents who are like, testify, right? No matter what faith you grew up in, you get Pentecostal at that comment. It's easy to assume that you have a good relationship with your kids when they smile and say the right things, and then you discover that they've been doing something behind your back for years, and a crisis happens, and you've got to reevaluate everything. It's easy for a company, big or small, to sail forward making gobs of money, and then suddenly they get hit with a huge lawsuit, or some other competitor, whatever, comes up with a competing service, and suddenly their customers are gone. And they've got to figure out what they're going to do now to keep all these people employed. It's easy to look like a genius when things are simple, but when crisis hits, it reveals who we really are. And that's the idea that tonight I want to look at John 1 through 27 as a crisis. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at this crisis, this same series of events, from 3 different perspectives. We're going to look at it from the perspective of Jesus. We're going to look at it from the perspective of Peter. And then we're going to look at it from the perspective of the religious leaders who arrest Jesus. And the key thing here is it is the exact same series of events. The same words are said, the same things are done, and yet from 3 different perspectives, it reveals 3 radically different things about the people involved. So I'm actually going to start tonight by reading the whole section so we get a sense of what's really going on, and then we're going to start talking about Jesus. Starting in verse 18, or chapter 18, verse 1, it says, "After these things, Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley with his disciples and entered a grove of olive trees. Judas, the betrayer, knew this place because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and temple guards to accompany him. Now, with blazing torches, lanterns, and weapons, they arrived at the olive grove." Just stop and think about the picture. It's dark, right? Dark in ways we really recognize it's dark. They're in this overcast thing. It's late in the evening, and suddenly a group of men shows up with torches, lanterns, and weapons. This is a scary moment if you're one of the disciples. Jesus fully realized that all that was going to happen to him, so he stepped forward to meet them. "Who are you looking for?" he asked. "Jesus the Nazarene," they replied. "I am he." Jesus said. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. And Jesus said, "I am he." And they all drew back and fell to the ground. Once more he asked them, "Who are you looking for?" And they replied, "Jesus the Nazarene, I am he." 3 times, the exact same phrase, "I am he." "And since I am the one you want, let these others go." He did this to fulfill his own statement, "I did not lose a single one of those you have given me." Then Simon Peter drew a sword and slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. But Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Shall I not drink from the cup of suffering my Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their commanding officer, and the temple guards arrested Jesus, tied him up, and they took him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at that time. Caiaphas was the one who had told the other Jewish leaders, "It's better that one man should die for the people." Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate. The disciple who knew the high priest spoke with the woman watching at the gate, and she said, "Let Peter in." The woman asked Peter, "You're not one of these man's disciples, are you?" "No," he said, "I am not." Because it was cold outside, the servants and the guards made a charcoal fire. They stood around it warming themselves, and Peter stood with them warming himself. Inside, the high priest began asking Jesus about his followers and what he had been teaching them. And Jesus replied, "Everyone knows what I teach. I have preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple where the people gather. Have I not spoken in secret? Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard you. They know what I said." Then one of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. "Is that the way to answer the high priest?" he demanded. Jesus replied, "If I said anything wrong, you must prove it, but I am speaking the truth. Why are you beating me?" And then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas the high priest. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, "You're not one of the disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "No, I am not." But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" Again, Peter denied it, and immediately a rooster crowed. So, we're talking about a crisis tonight. And I want to talk about Jesus' perspective through this whole thing at first. And the first point tonight is this: the arrest and trial reveal Jesus as steadfast and unwavering in his mission. It is fascinating to see, amidst all the chaos, just how straightforward, how plodding along, how simple his reaction to everything is. And John says it here at the beginning, right? In verse 4, Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to him, so he stepped forward to meet them. Again, the reason why John says what he says in verse 3 is to set the mental picture so that we see in our minds what's going on. It's not as if a small group of men come to try to take Jesus in quietly. It's a large, dangerous group of men who's ready, apparently, to shed blood in order to take this man in. It is a dangerous and potentially violent situation. And Jesus walks right into it without any hesitation. He walks right up to the people who are part of the crowd who has torches, lanterns, and weapons. It's right. The only thing that's missing here is pitchforks, right? It is a group ready to take him by any means necessary, and Jesus walks right up to them and engages them immediately. There's this back and forth where Jesus says, "I am he," and the Greek there is ego, eimi, which is the same phrase that he uses when he says, "I am the bread of life, I am the water of life." It is the same phrase that God reveals as his divine name in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, or the Greek version of the Old Testament. Jesus says, "I am God, and I am the one you are looking for." It's a double entendre there. It has two meanings at the same time. I am the one you're looking for, but I am also God. And he says it 3 times because 3 is really important if you're a Trinitarian, like we all should be. And he confronts them, and then Peter, though, and this is the thing, Peter sees the exact same scenario. He sees the lanterns, the torches, and the weapons, and Peter freaks out. Peter has a fight or flight reaction here. He fights. He pulls out his sword, and he chops off an ear. And Peter is immediately rebuked by Jesus. He says, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup of suffering the Father has given me?" What's fascinating here is Jesus is asked a bunch of abusive questions by his enemies. He is slapped across the face, and he is arrested under false pretenses. And the only person he rebukes in this whole scenario is Peter, who tries to defend him. Peter does what Peter thinks Peter must do in order to protect this man who he has been with for 3 years. And Jesus rebukes him, and it is not because Jesus doesn't understand what is about to happen. He knows exactly what has to happen. "Shall I not drink from the cup of suffering my Father has given me?" Peter is helping him, trying to prevent him from going to the cross. And Jesus says, "No, this is what has to happen." Other passages in the Synoptic Gospels talk about how Jesus heals Malchus and puts the ear back on. And so the scene goes on, and so the soldiers take him back, and they go to the father-in-law of the high priest. Interestingly, Caiaphas is somebody who's very interesting to me. A long time ago, when we first got married, my wife and I were given tickets by my in-laws to go to a museum where we got to see the actual burial box of Caiaphas. You could see the stone burial box with his initials of the family name carved into the side of the box. It was fascinating to see where his bones stood and then know the story that happened to him here. So he's in this place, and there's this interlude between 12 and 18 that sort of, it does 2 things. Narratively, what this interlude does is it gives us a chance. It sort of helps us follow the story, the narrative. It's a scene. It's a cut scene, if you will. We see this all the time in both TV and movies and books, where a scene ends and then a character is traveling. And so rather than narrate the traveling, they cut to a different scene. And it gives us the sense that time has passed. So while they're taking Jesus in, there's this scene that we'll talk about when it comes to Peter. And then we get back to this thing. And immediately in verse 19, the high priest, Annas or Caiaphas, begins to question Jesus. And Caiaphas begins beating around the bush, asking about his followers. What's interesting here is what seems to be going on is Caiaphas doesn't just want to silence the man at the center. He wants to take the followers and silence them too. He wants to know who's involved so we can cut off everyone in one fell swoop. Jesus says, no, you're here for me. And he's asking about Jesus' teaching. And again, Jesus' simple response is, everybody knows, why are we even going through this exercise? This is pointless. You know what you're going to do. You know what I'm going to say. We all know how this is going to end. So why are we doing this dance? And then Jesus' simple response doesn't carry enough respect. And so a temple guard slaps Jesus across the face. Think about this. The Son of God is now slapped across the face by a man who he is preparing to die for. And Jesus replies, he doesn't defend himself. He doesn't get angry. He simply turns to the man or turns to the people after being slapped. If I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I am speaking the truth, why are you beating me? What's fascinating about this whole situation, and it gets more fascinating when you look at these same events through the lens of Peter, is Jesus doesn't flag, he doesn't waver, he doesn't pause, he doesn't hesitate. When crisis strikes, when the moment happens where he has to make the life or death decision, where he has to put himself in the hands of his enemies, he doesn't pause or hesitate or waver. He simply steps forward. And this is in radical contrast to the second person tonight, Peter. The second point tonight, and we're going to spend a lot longer on this one, is the arrest and trial reveal Peter as hopelessly unreliable and hopelessly chaotic. He's unreliable and he's chaotic, and here's what I mean. Before all of this goes down, Peter is and has always been the loudmouth of the bunch. Right? When somebody needs to say something dumb, Peter's always first in line. Right? When Jesus says that when the disciples are arguing with one another about who's going to be the best, Jesus says, guys, you aren't prepared to drink the cup that I'm about to drink. And Peter says, oh, I am. Right? When Jesus is washing the disciples' feet to show them what it's like to serve one another, Peter doesn't understand. He says, well, if you're going to wash my feet, if you insist on doing it, why don't you just give me a sponge bath through my whole body? Right? When Jesus says that you're all going to abandon me, Peter demands and stands up and he's heard to say, I will never leave you. I would die for you. And all of that is in the background of what happens in this critical moment when this mob comes to arrest Jesus. Peter's fight or flight kicks in. Peter knows the game he's been talking. He knows he's been talking big about how he'd never leave Jesus, how he's prepared to do whatever it takes, how he is the best and the most worthy of the ones who is claiming to follow Jesus. And so when the armed guards show up, he pulls out a sword and he takes off an ear. Peter does what Peter thinks Peter must do in order for Peter to protect Jesus. He does what we all think we would do in a similar situation. Somebody we know is innocent, who's about to be betrayed into the hands of people who want them dead, we think we would stand up and protect them. This is what Peter knows. Peter knows these guys have been after him, after Jesus. He knows that they've been trying to get him for years, and he knows that if they take possession of Jesus now, he will not walk out of there alive. Peter knows the context of the situation. He knows the politics of the situation, and he knows that they will stop at nothing to silence him. And Peter sees this as a moment where Jesus either escapes or he dies, and he tries to prevent him from dying. And Jesus steps up and begins to shed blood for Jesus. And then, to his own surprise, he is rebuked. Have you ever been called down for doing the exact thing you thought you should do? Right? You walk to work and you expect your boss to meet you with a cup of coffee and a slap on the back, and then they yell at you for staying too late the night before and not being on the clock or not doing something right. Or maybe you worked off the clock to get a project done and they yell at you because the project wasn't done right. Or I don't know, you did the dishes and then you find out from your spouse that you did the dishes wrong. I don't know. We've all done that. It's a surprising and it's an unsettling thing when we expect applause and we get rebuke. And Peter expects at least Jesus to appreciate it. He expects Jesus to appreciate the fact that only he stands up for Jesus when everybody else runs away. Where's everybody else now? Jesus, I'm the one who pulled out my sword. I showed you, I told you, I'm special. Let's get these guys and get out of here so you can show everybody who you really are. And instead, Jesus rebukes him. And I don't know if it is the surprise rebuke, but after this moment, Peter becomes a totally different man. We don't know how Peter actually gets away. We don't know the mechanics of how this happens, but we know that from verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus. So on the one hand, he begins to shed blood to protect him. That apparently is wrong. And so, but Peter knows everybody else has abandoned him, me and one other person. We don't know who this other person was. The other disciple, it's unnamed. People think it's John. Peter and this other disciple follow Jesus in. Again, Peter does something that almost none of the other disciples do. It's applause-worthy. It's helpful, right? Peter is staying close when almost everybody else has completely abandoned him. And Peter does, again, something that is good. But this is the key. Peter is radically conflicted at this moment. Because although he's following, and although he is staying close and hasn't abandoned Jesus all by himself, Peter still has a bit of self-preservation left in him. He has the nerve and the guts to follow this mob along to Annas' house and then to the Caiaphas' place. Maybe there's the same house, who knows? To this place, this destination. He's got the guts to follow them and the guts to go into this courtyard and be among the enemies, among the group of people who just arrested Jesus. That is a gutsy move. And yet, the need, the desire, the hope to be there for Jesus ends up dying at the next moment. Right? Peter is there, right? And a woman sees him. She says, "You're not one of the man's disciples, are you?" "No, I'm not." He's got guts enough to follow, but not guts enough to reveal. And so Peter sticks around. Whew. Okay, they didn't spot me, right? They didn't see me. Nobody's arresting me. I'll hang around just a little bit longer to see what happens on the outskirts, outside the building. And then there's this another interlude where the high priest questions Jesus, and then Peter, again in verse 25, right? He's standing by this fire, this charcoal fire that they created, warming himself, and two more people give him the chance to speak up and to reveal that he is one of Jesus' most trusted inward advisors, and Peter denies both times. Other books say that he curses as he denies. His denials get stronger and more vehement. Peter here is unreliable in the fact that on one moment, he's whipping out a sword to destroy those who come to arrest Jesus, and at the next moment, he's denying that he even knows him. The same night, the same few hours, maybe even the same few minutes. He's chaotic in the fact that when in one situation he is shedding blood, in another situation he's skulking at the back of a mob, in a third situation he's denying who he is. Think about how absolutely torn apart Peter has to be inside at this moment. This is a moment that for Peter has gotten away from him. And again, we've all been there. I've been there preaching on stage. I remember. I don't really have notes anymore. I have the same notes you have. I have been preaching since I was 15 years old, and so I've made just about every mistake you can make, right? I've done everything wrong, and I remember I had preached just long enough to think I really knew what I was doing. So I stopped bringing such detailed notes, and I had prepared a sermon that I was hoping would only be 45 minutes. And we're at a Pentecostal church, so we've got to be long because we don't want to beat the Baptists to lunch, or else they'll get bragging rights on us and it'll be bad, right? We got to be there after the Baptists. And so we're preaching, and I'm going, and I reach the end of my notes, and it's 11:30. My 45-minute sermon was 10 minutes, and then I spent 20 minutes filling, and everybody knew I was filling. It was the most brutal and uncomfortable thing. I have preached with my fly down. I have preached, right? I have preached and I have been insulted in front of a crowd. Everything that can go wrong to go on. I was standing in front of a group of 800 people one time, and my belt broke. And my pants started falling down in front of me. And I had to do a corporate presentation for 15 minutes in front of 800 people and a CEO of a company I was working for holding my pants so that I wouldn't moon everybody. I know what it's like to be in a situation where everything goes wrong, everything goes south, the moment is bigger than you, and you're just trying to get on. This is what I'm talking about when it comes to chaos. The reaction of Jesus to the exact same situation as Peter is 100% opposite. And it is because of this. Jesus has been spending his entire life preparing for this one moment. He's told his disciples about it again and again and again. Jesus has been living the same life his entire life, doing exactly what he needed to do, being exactly who he needed to be, preparing and anticipating and expecting this moment where the mob shows up at his favorite place to pray. He told his disciples exactly what was going to happen. And when everything falls apart, Jesus simply continues to be who he's always been. There is nothing remarkable about what Jesus does here, and that is the remarkable thing. Everything goes crazy. The crowd finally gets him. They arrest him. They put him in chains. They slap him. They beat him. They abuse him. He is separated from all of his followers. And Jesus simply puts one foot in front of the other, not hesitating at all. The remarkable thing about Jesus in this situation is that he does nothing remarkable at all. Whereas Peter is all over the place. We see Peter in these few verses in three different physical locations. In the garden, we see him trailing along behind the mob, and then we see him in the outer courtyard. And in all three physical locations, in this one very rapid series of events, each time we see him, he is doing something radically different. He's cutting off an ear, he's skulking at the back of the crowd, and then he's denying that he even knows who Jesus is. And the reality is that this moment is the same moment for Peter that it is for Jesus. The exact same things are going on. The exact same situation is happening. The problem is Jesus has spent his whole life preparing for this moment. And although Jesus has been telling Peter about this moment for years, Peter has never once prepared. And so when the crisis happens, Peter, who has been talked a big game and said everything right and has been believed that in the good times, he has shown himself to be the best. When everything happens and the crisis arises, he reveals himself to be completely not up to the challenge. Peter thought he was one of the best, and nothing he does in this moment is right. He cuts and defends when he should allow Jesus to go. He follows when he can do nothing to help him. And when he's given an opportunity to stand up and proclaim his allegiance to Jesus, he swallows and hides and pretends and lies. Crisis revealed who Jesus was, and crisis revealed who Peter was. And we can wash all of that away by saying that, well, Jesus was God, and so he could handle all of this, but I think that is an overly simplistic reading. The thing that has been pounding into my mind over the last 3 or 4 days as I've been thinking about this and talking about it and writing through it in my notes is this. When crisis hits, who we've always been will be who we are. The problem is we think in good times that we're like Jesus, that we've got it all figured out, we can handle it, we're making all the right decisions, we're strong and good and we're faithful and everything's fine. And what we don't do in the good times is do the work to prepare. We don't live how we're supposed to live. We don't cultivate the relationships we're supposed to cultivate. We don't build the habits we're supposed to build. And we don't realize or appreciate it until the crisis has already struck. But when the crisis hits, who we are is who we are. We wait to give attention to our spouse until they say they're going to walk out. You can't do 8 years of marriage counseling in 1 week because they said that they were leaving you. We wait until we realize that our child has made some horrendous decisions or has gone to a place that we didn't realize they would go to. Or we wait until our child leaves the house and we find out that they have walked away from the church or they have walked away from faith. They have abandoned the Christian worldview. And then we freak out. I've had more than one person call me crying, panicking because their child has abandoned the Christian worldview. The problem is they had 18 years to put it into their life. They never bothered doing it until they realized that their kid is off in college 100 miles away. They're not at home anymore. And suddenly they realize they wasted the 18 years and they can't get it back. The problem that we have when we live our lives is when things are easy, we assume they'll always be easy. And we don't cultivate the habits and the patterns of behavior and the character that we must have that will sustain us through the crisis. And then when crisis hits, we think we're going to be Jesus, but we turn out to be Peter. The problem is when crisis hits, you can't fix it. You can't become somebody new after the crisis hits. You can't make up for 5 years of Bible reading in 1 week after you've lost your job. It doesn't work like that. You can't wait until your life has blown up to begin to build the habits and the relationships and the thick character you must have, that you're commanded to have. You must cultivate those in better times so that they're there when everything falls apart. And the difference between Jesus and Peter here is Jesus has always been exactly who he needed to be. He has always had the character that he required. He has always had the identity that he required. He has always been preparing for this moment. And when the moment comes, he just continues to walk. But Peter has ignored Jesus' warnings. He's ignored Jesus' teachings. He has not embraced what Jesus has done, prepared, and showed. And so Jesus, despite the fact that he thinks he's hot stuff, shows up completely overwhelmed by the situation. My fear is that we, in times of plenty and in times of ease, so deeply ease up on the things that we know we must do, that when everything falls apart, we are completely incapable of handling it in the way that Jesus would. But I digress. We have a third lens to view this series of situations through. And it is through the religious leaders. At the end of John 17, I'm going to read John 17 verses 20 on through the end of the chapter, because it really is important for what we see here. I am praying not only for these disciples, but also for all who will ever believe in me through their message. I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one. As you and as you are in me, Father, and I am in you, and may they be in us, so that the world will believe you sent me. I have given them the glory you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one. I am in them, and you are in me. May they experience such perfect unity that the world will know that you sent me, and that you love them as much as you love me. Father, I want these whom you have given me to be with me where I am. Then they can see all the glory you gave me, because you loved me even before the world began. O righteous Father, the world doesn't know you, but I do. And these disciples know you sent me. I have revealed them to you, and I will continue to do so. Then your love for me will be in them, and I will be in them. Jesus' final prayer, for those of you who were here last week, was all about unity. Unity not with the world, unity not with people who denied Jesus as Savior, but unity in people who call themselves Christians. His prayer, his desire, his demand is that those people who claim to be part of the people of God find unity with one another. What is ironic here is how the religious leaders find perfect unity and their desire to silence Jesus. The third point is that the arrest and trial reveal the religious leaders as united in their blindness. I've talked at length at times before about how the religious landscape of Jesus' day was as fractured, maybe even more fractured than ours is today. We have Baptists and Presbyterians and Pentecostals and Methodists and non-denominationals and charismatics and subgroups of subgroups of subgroups. In Jesus' day, it was the same basic thing. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, the Sicarii, groups that are in the Bible that we know of in the Bible, and many groups that we know of that are not mentioned specifically in the Bible. And all of them believed they were the righteous Jews, the real Jews, and everybody else was posers, fakes, half in, half out, lukewarm Jews who got maybe some at best, but were not like us, the good Jews. Just like we think our group, our church, our denomination, our faith group is the best. Everybody else is meh, but hopefully they become like us. I was in seminary, I had to take several church history classes, and I saw the professor was it was on the Reformation, so Martin Luther, John Calvin, and that sort of stuff. And the professor, she started out with a comic, and it had a picture of the church, and it was the church, and then it had the schism in 1095 where the East and the West broke off, and then it had all the denominations, this branching of trees, and it had this little circle right at the very end with a little circle, and it says, "This is us," at the very end of all of these different branches. And it had a word bubble of one of the kids' head. It says, "Thank God we came along and finally got it right." We have such an arrogant view that our personal, specific faith community is the only good one. Jesus lived in a world like that, and the great irony of that world is the one man who united all of these religious leaders was Jesus. And they united themselves in order to take him out. Pharisees and Sadducees who'd argued over whether you could be a good Jew if you were like a Pharisee and didn't go to the temple enough. You couldn't be a good Jew because you weren't at the temple enough. Pharisees accused the Sadducees of overemphasizing the sacrificial system and not paying attention to personal holiness enough. And so Pharisees thought Sadducees were bad Jews, and Sadducees thought Pharisees were bad Jews. But you know what? They were better than Jesus, and so they were willing to team up to take him down. They all stared the Son of God in the face, heard him speak, heard him teach, watched him do miracles, questioned the people who he healed, and all of them united to silence him. They took him out, or so they thought. These were the experts, the leaders, the most popular ones, the most well-known ones, the ones who had the most schooling and the most clout. They were the most politically aligned group. They were the most influential group. They were the ones who told everybody else how to be a good Jew, how to be faithful to the law. They were the ones who had it all together. And one of them slaps Jesus in the face for being uppity with the high priest. The irony is not to be lost. The law, the Mosaic law, goes to great lengths to talk about how whenever a lamb is to be sacrificed, it must be spotless, without blemish. And here, just mere moments before the lamb, who was the lamb that all the other lambs were supposed to point to, goes to the cross, somebody smacks him across the face, whips him a good one. And if you've ever been smacked really hard, it leaves a mark. And that is the man for whom Jesus is about to die. The reaction to Jesus in this situation, the reaction of the Pharisees at this moment in these events reveals something significant. It is that the people who are the most popular, who are the most knowledgeable, who are the most influential, who are the most significant, who have the loudest voice and the most who are the most well-connected politically, can also be the absolute blindest people in the world. It reveals that although when we sit in a pew or in a seat or listen to a preacher on television or think of some well-known ministry leader, we have a tendency to glorify. We have a tendency to see them as these hyper Christ-like examples, these glorious people that we should be like. But the danger of us following any individual is that these men, the high priest, who was the one who offered the sacrifice every single year, that was pointing to and anticipating the one who was sitting in his own house, looked him right in the face and was blind as a bat. This exact same series of events reveals Jesus as remarkably unremarkable, the same man he has always been, one foot in front of the other, in full control despite all of the chaos around him. Jesus is chained up, he's still in control. He's standing in front of a mob, he's still in control. He's drugged to this enemy's house, he's still in control. They're questioning him, trying to take down everybody around him, he's still in control. He's beaten and slapped, and he's still in control. And at the end of this section, right before Peter denies Jesus 2 more times, Annas binds him and sends him up to the high priest. And he is still in control. What that tells us is that we don't need to be in control of individual events to be absolutely in control. If we live like Jesus, which is the whole goal, I'll say it again, Jesus did not come to earth, live and die and rise again to create a religion so that we could wait with bated breath to escape and do no good here. He came to this earth because this earth really matters to him. Jesus showed us what it was like to walk into a violently chaotic situation with absolute conviction and certainty and surety. Because he was who he always needed to be, and no matter what happened, no matter the circumstance, whether he's in full control with the disciples or whether he's being led away in chains, he puts one foot in front of the other because that is who he's always been. Jesus shows us what we should be, what we could be, what we aim to be. Peter looks at the exact same situation and he is completely overwhelmed, overtaken by the entire situation. He shows up and he cuts when he's supposed to let Jesus go, and he denies when he's supposed to stand up, and he follows when he can do no good. Peter does everything wrong because he never took the time to prepare, to live, to grow, to become what Jesus wanted him to become. And so when everything fell apart, he wasn't who he was supposed to be. So while Jesus reveals to us what we should be, Peter reveals to us in moments of crisis what we often are. People who haven't done the homework, show up for the final, and are completely overwhelmed. And the religious leaders show us what we can potentially become. People who are so self-righteous, so certain, so sure that we have all of the right answers, that we can look God and his work right in the face, deny it, beat it up, and do our best to silence it. The thing that's been spinning around in my mind is that every single one of us is either going into a crisis, coming out of a crisis, or in a crisis. Some of us might be spinning crises like multiple plates right now. If you are not in a crisis, do the work today to become who Christ wants you to be, so that when you hit that crisis, you've already developed the relationship, already developed the Christ-like habits, already become who he is wanting you to be and empowering you to be, so that you can walk confidently through a situation, even if you have absolutely no control. And if you're in a crisis now, and these words are coming just a bit too late, my hope, my fear is, my prayer is that you learn, that you recognize, and that you now, when this crisis passes, that you begin to put in the work once again. That you do the daily disciplines, the Bible reading, the prayer, the gathering, all of the small stuff which seems unnecessary and inconsequential when we've got all of our stuff together. Because crisis is coming. And it will beat you upside the head like a baseball bat. Crisis in your marriage, crisis in your kids and your parenting, crisis in your work, crisis in your finances. In every one of these areas, these and every area in our life, Scripture lays out critical principles that we need to be doing right now when times are good, so that when things fall apart, we have done what we needed to do and become who we needed to be. If you're already broke, it's too late to learn how to save money. And my prayer is that none of us are so certain of our own selves, so sure of our own selves, that we look at the work of God because it doesn't look like we think it should look, act like we think it should act, talk like we think it should talk, then we deny it and fight against it. Lord, dear Lord, please let us never fight against the actual work that God is doing. Let us be open to hear him, to see him, to recognize him, so we don't get to the end and realize that we have been fighting against God all along. It was people who called themselves the people of God who spearheaded the revolt against the work of God. That can happen again like it happened then. I want to pray, and then we'll take some discussion. Father God, crisis is a terrifying thing. No one wants to go through it, but we all have to deal with it. And my guess is that there are people in this room who are on the precipice of something awful. Maybe they don't see it coming. They don't know it's coming. They don't know what's going to happen. But God, you see it coming. You know whether a crisis is going to happen in a week or a month or a year. And my prayer, God, tonight is for those of us who need a wake-up call to do what we need to do, to be faithful to the demands of Scripture, to build the right small habits, that we listen so that we can stand tall when our world falls apart. Let us be faithful stewards of the time that we have with young kids in our homes, so we're not looking back with regret after they leave and abandon what we should have taught them. Let us be faithful in our finances, so that if something comes along, we don't regret living at the edge for too long. Let us be faithful in our relationship with you, so that if everything falls apart, we don't wish we would have spent the last several years diving deep into your word and getting deep into a relationship with you. Let us not live with regret over the small things we could have done but decided not to do, so that we can be strong when our world crumbles, like you are strong when everything seemed to cave in. Let this be a time of solace, of preparation, so that we can make it to the other side, just like you. In Jesus' name, amen.